So you put editing aside. You're going to go and or you decide to transition to being, I assume, full-time mom. Did I follow that quite right?
Yeah, a full-time mom, and I sort of said, I want to write. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be working on my writing, and I also went to the Met to train to become a volunteer educator there, docent. And so that sort of ended up feeling like almost a full-time job the first year of training. They take it very seriously. I mean, coming from having actually been in a full-time job, it didn't feel like a full-time job, but it was like 2 to 3 days a week of work, or volunteer work. And so I was kind of doing all of those, juggling all of those at once. And then I really became much more focused on the writing after my second child was born. And I think at that point, when she was a year and I sort of had gotten through those early days, I was like, this is what I want to do with my life. I had to become very determined and very clear, this is what I want in my life. I will not be happy unless I publish a book and I become a writer, an official writer, not just someone who says they want to be a writer. And I just was so determined to do it. And I just worked and worked. And so it was really a lot of, just kind of mental. For me, it was like a real mental game to get myself to this point, which I don't think it's as much for everyone, but for me, that was really, it was a lot of complexity about, imposter syndrome, not worrying about how good something was. I think that's where the editing side kind of has a negative effect, because it was a positive and a negative, because I think in some ways the positive is I had the benefit of seeing manuscripts come in that were not in their final form and knowing what manuscripts go through in order to become a final book. I think a lot of people out there who want to write, you see a finished book and you read it and you think, oh, wow, the person just sat down and wrote this and look what came out. And you don't realize, even if you've read about how much work it took, or you don't really realize what it takes. I mean, maybe some people do sit just down and just come out with a book, and maybe that happens. But I will say there was one writer, and I won't name names, who we worked with, who I think came in pretty near perfect. But I saw a range of different experiences. So I think that was beneficial in terms of realizing it doesn't have to be perfect. At the same time, I also had very high standards for myself, and it's very easy, hard to turn off that internal editor, which is hard for any writer to do, to turn off the internal editor that says this isn't good enough, or this isn't working. So for me, it was really learning how to turn that off and just write, and whatever came out, and I'd fix it later. And of course, then the fixing it later part is also hard. So it's been a real learning process, I think, especially over the last 10 years of how to be a writer, also how to come up with story. I think for me, I would start with a very vague image, maybe a character, a voice, some really tiny grain of a spark, and learning how to take that tiny thing and make it into a whole novel, not just 3 pages of pretty writing on a little idea. That was a big process for me also. So, it's been a fascinating experience in terms of, mental and creative growth and discipline, and just really wonderful in that regard.
Well, presumably because you had worked with so many authors, you've got a pretty good idea of going into it, what's going to be required of you, what being a successful author, what that attitude entails, what that looks like. So when you switch it on, you say, okay, this is the moment, I'm doing this no matter what. What does that transition look like in practical terms? How much time are you spending writing, reading every day? What does your life look like at that point?
So that's a really good question, and a very definite answer, which for me came from Sarah Mlynowski, the author, Sarah Mlynowski, who wrote Whatever After and Upside Down Magic and a bunch of YA books. And I met her in person. I'd sort of known of her, but it turned out that her daughter went to the same school as my daughter. And we have a very funny story about how we met, but basically when my daughter was starting kindergarten, she kind of took me under her wing. Her daughter was a grade ahead. And she was like, because I told her I wanted to be a writer and I was struggling to finish something and get through it. And she said, okay, I'm going to take you every day. We're going to go to a cafe across the street from school where they have no internet, and we're going to sit down and you're just going to write. And so it was amazing. I mean, I would say for the first 6 months or something, she just was like, let's go meet at the cafe, or we're going to the cafe and we're sitting down, and we would talk a lot. And I loved getting to know her as a friend and a person, but also just like that, getting that discipline of like, if you want to write, you bring your laptop and you go and you sit there and you do it. There's not all this like thinking about it and talking about it. It's really the act of doing it, which is, sounds crazy that that's the hardest part, but for me it is. And so I think I really sort of got into this rhythm of like, okay, I drop my kids off at school and I go and I do my work, and starting to set real goals for myself. Like, I have to do 500 words today before I can get up. I have to, get to this part. I have to do that. And being very like, which I'm not good at, going back to the whole research thing and being an academic, like I'm not a disciplined person necessarily. I sort of like to go as things happen, see as things go and float around. And that doesn't really work in real life. So figuring out how to set those definite goals was helpful for me, which not everybody needs it, but I did need it. But at the same time, now that I've gone through that process, I will say, like, you always hear, oh, each book becomes its own challenge to write. Like, just because you write one doesn't mean that, people say the next one is still hard. And it's true, but I do think that there definitely was a learning curve for me in terms of like, okay, I know I can do this. I can write a full manuscript and I can revise it 15 times and I can get it to a point where it can get sold, and then I can revise it 4 more times, and I can get it published. And going through that process has given me a confidence to feel like, I think I can do this again. I mean, it's scary, but it's definitely, it's sort of like you can recall how that feeling is and get back into it, even, in new circumstances, if that makes any sense. I think I'm...
Oh, it does. You had mentioned that because you had spent so much time as an editor and making sure that you're getting your manuscripts perfect, and also, they're not your babies. I'm sure you love them as much as every editor loves a manuscript they work on. But I'm sure it's a little bit different when it's your manuscript, which is why writers don't edit their own manuscripts most of the time, the smart ones anyway. So how do you get from that mindset of sitting down to edit to just the drafting stage? So let me get this out, let it be ugly, let me get past that voice that says, you missed a comma, stop everything, go back. or whatever your punctuation hang up might have been.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think it's not even a choice, because the words, first of all, I think like writing on a computer is a whole weird thing. And I've always done it on a computer because you're constantly deleting and moving and cutting and pasting. And at least I am. Like, as I'm writing, I'm editing, right? I think most people who type on a computer do. So it's very easy to just quickly type out words and sentences, and they're definitely not perfect. And I don't worry too much about the commas and punctuation and all that. I think it's more just moving forward. And I think my process is not that clear cut. Like, I don't outline and plot and do all that, but I think to me it's just the idea that I write a couple of pages, and then the next writing session I'll tend to read over what I've done and clean it up and edit and go through, and that just also gets me back into the story and the rhythm of what I've been writing, by going back and making little tweaks and playing around with sentences and paragraphs, and that kind of sparks me again to what I'm writing next, because I don't plan it out. So I kind of have to get back into it every time. But I think, and as I said, even with the finished book, I could look at it and, re-edit every single sentence. And so that's why I'm so grateful and fortunate to have my wonderful editor, Martha Mihalik, and being published now, so that somebody else can take it and be like, okay, it's done. It's not up to me anymore, because if it was up to me, it would never be done. So.
And as many points of me, I'm assuming this isn't the first novel you wrote once you got going, or is it you rewrote it enough times to get it where it needed to be?
Yeah, I've had a lot of half-written novels that I had done. Not a lot, but quite a few. And then, where I'd sort of give up at page 100 and not really know where it was going, because, as I said, I don't plan anything, and I just kind of hope that I'll get to the end. And then I did write one other book that was sort of a little more YA that I couldn't figure out how to revise. Because, as I said, I sort of got to the point where I was like, okay, I just have to finish something. And I finished it, and then I was like, now what? And I couldn't figure out how to revise it. I think I had my second child in that time period. So then when I finally went back to writing again when she was 1 in 2014, I think I might have looked at that old thing, and then I got the first glimmer of an idea for this. and went through, I mean, the very first draft of what I would consider would be the first draft of Many Points of Me looks nothing like what it is now. There's a few similarities in terms of premise maybe, but it could be its own book. It's like so different. So I'll like write a whole thing and then I'll completely rewrite it and completely rewrite it, you know, for page one, which sounds crazy and maddening. And I don't know if it's how sustainable that will be going forward. I'm kind of running up against that problem now where I'm like, okay, now I actually have a deadline for this book and I don't have the luxury of spending 5 years rewriting it. But that's kind of, yeah, how my process went for this.